So thank you very much for everybody to be here with us. We're going to start this afternoon with a presentation on campaigning for nuclear disarmament in the British and Irish Isles. I'm Claire Mansour. I'm a teacher and researcher here in this university. And I'm a specialist of social movements in the UK. Mainly in contemporary history. Yeah, and I've never introduced myself in this situation. Very interesting exercise. So my name is Marie-Violaine Louvet. I'm also a lecturer here, and my research focuses on political activism in Ireland and Northern Ireland in the 20th and 21st century. I used to work on transnational solidarity between Irish activists and activists in the Middle East. And at the moment, I'm focusing on the anti-war movement or movements in Ireland. Right. So, born out of a moral opposition to nuclear weapons and the threat they represented for humankind, the movement for nuclear disarmament spanned across the British and Irish Isles from the late 1950s to the mid-1960s. It started with the creation of the Direct Action Committee Against Nuclear War in April 1957, originally formed to support an expedition to sail to the Christmas Islands to protest against Britain's first atmospheric nuclear tests. This small group was to become the hardcore of the movement and initiated most of the non-violent direct actions throughout the period. In January 1958, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, was formed in London and advocated more conventional tactics in order to garner mass appeal. It would become the main organization of the movement. Later on, in October 1960, the Committee of 100 was set up to launch a civil disobedience campaign and escalate protests. Their strategy was to ensure, through pledges taken beforehand, that any action carried out would have a minimum of 2,000 participants. Those three associations revolved around the central figure of the movement, the philosopher Bertrand Russell. The movement's most notorious actions were undoubtedly the long Easter marches from the Centre for Nuclear Research in Aldermaston to London. But the movement was neither limited to this type of action nor to the geographic boundaries of England. Far from it. In fact, it still took on a variety of forms in each of the nations of the archipelago, adapting to local political and cultural specificities and giving them a unique expression. This presentation will seek to explain how these mobilizations emerged in reaction to the same conjuncture and were then shaped by their own national contexts. Okay, so first I'm going to tell you a few words regarding the international context. So the campaigns for nuclear disarmament were set up in the late 1950s and remained active until the mid-1960s. These years, as you know, were characterized by the geopolitical context of the Cold War. In 1946, in his Sinews of Peace speech, Churchill referred to the formation of an Iron Curtain that divided Europe between an Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc, communist and capitalist countries, with an allegiance to the USSR or the United States. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance between the member states, was formed the following year, while in 1955, the USSR and its satellite communist regimes in Eastern Europe ratified the Warsaw Pact, which guaranteed mutual protection to all the signatories. Such military alliances made the possibility of a global nuclear war plausible. In the mid-1950s, American President Eisenhower formulated the domino theory, explaining that if a country fell into a communist regime, others in the region would be likely to follow the lead. Consequently, communism had to be fought in the entire world, including Asia and America. The 1956 Suez Crisis showed that the UK was less of a major player on the international stage and had become rather dependent on the United States. The news of Britain's action in Egypt came as a shock to British people and led to demonstrations and pickets organized by pacifists and anti-colonial organizations that were an inspiration for the campaigns that we are going to discuss during this presentation. So these contexts went together with an arms race and a nuclear arms race that took place between the United States, the USSR, and their allies. This arms race and nuclear arms race caused fears regarding the possibility of a nuclear attack and a nuclear Armageddon. Anti-nuclear armament activists anxiously followed the progress in the research on nuclear armaments, and their actions were organized in relation to the decisions made by the nuclear superpowers. The competition for supremacy in nuclear armament started in 1945 with the American use of the atomic bomb on Japan to end the Second World War. But the USSR was not far behind, since they first tested their nuclear weapon in 1949 and started putting nuclear missiles on submarines in 1950. In the early 1950s, the US tested the first hydrogen bomb, a thermonuclear device with an explosion 500 times larger than the Nagasaki bomb in the North Pacific. In 1952, Britain became the third country to obtain the atomic bomb. 5 years later, the USSR tested their first intercontinental ballistic missile capable of delivering nuclear warheads in minutes to the United States. And Britain succeeded in detonating its first hydrogen bomb in the Christmas Islands. In 1961, the USSR tested the largest nuclear weapon ever built, 4,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. So you see the combination of technological progress in nuclear armaments and the geopolitical instability created a climate of fear. If a global conflict were to start, it could be synonymous with the end of human life. This explains mobilizations in countries that were not directly involved in nuclear tests, such as the Republic of Ireland, that did not have plans to build a nuclear plant until the 1970s. Besides, in the late 1950s, the election of Sean Lemass, who succeeded Eamon de Valera as Taoiseach, the head of government in the Republic of Ireland, was instrumental in a renewed interest in foreign affairs and diplomacy.
Moving on to our second subpart, entitled A Moral Crusade Against Nuclear Weapons, in which I will explain the religious background of the movement and its moral dimension. Since the end of the Second World War, the ecumenical movement, that is the drive to bring all Christian denominations closer together in spite of their theological and dogmatic differences, had been given a new impetus. The creation in 1948 of the World Council of Churches, an association working for Christian unity, and the election of Pope John XXIII in 1958, celebrated for his more open-minded stance, both contributed to bring about a new spirit of religious tolerance. By the late 1950s, it became more frequent to hear religious leaders advocating respect and cooperation with other Christian faiths. This had a significant impact on the movement for nuclear disarmament, since many of its figures were religious leaders, as for instance, the Anglican priest John Collins, who was the canon of St. Paul's Cathedral and the chairman of CND, and whom you can see on the picture behind me. A striking feature of the movement for nuclear disarmament is that activists presented the issue of nuclear weapons in fundamentally moral terms, pitting the debate as a Manichaean struggle of good versus evil. For instance, the Aldermaston Charter, drafted in 1959 and given to the Prime Minister and the Archbishop of Canterbury at the end of the Easter March, declared, I quote, In faith and in reason, we affirm our conviction that nuclear arms are wholly evil. This also explained why some significant protests were organized on days that had a strong religious meaning, like Good Friday, Easter, and Whitsun. In 1958, the first year that the long Easter March was organized, it started from Trafalgar Square on Good Friday and arrived in Aldermaston on Easter Monday for the final rally closing the protest. Before the marches set off, Canon John Collins explained, I quote, "This is Good Friday, and you may wonder why a clergyman should be addressing this meeting instead of a meeting in church. The answer is quite simple. Good Friday stands supremely for a moral principle, and this business of hydrogen bombs and nuclear weapons is supremely a moral issue. I believe myself that the cross is a much more important symbol than the sword, and this march to Aldermaston and this campaign will succeed primarily because it is, in fact, the right thing." These words show not only that for those who had faith, the struggle for unilateral disarmament had become some sort of crusade, but it also shows that the main driving force of the activist motivational frame was that they were convinced that what they were doing was right. Non-religious leaders, like the writer and historian A.J.P. Taylor, appealed to common decency. I quote, "What civilized human being would accept the responsibility of pressing the button and releasing an H-bomb, thereby killing up to 5 million people and condemning children not yet born to be maimed, blind, cripples, idiots, and monsters?" This particular statement was the one which got the most applause at one of CND's first meetings in London in 1958, showing that it resonated with the perception of the rank and file of the movement. If the diagnostic frame or the problem identified by the activists was linked to the unprecedented destructive potential of nuclear weapons, their prognostic frame, that is the solution that they put forward in the UK, was unilateral disarmament. They wanted Britain to take the first step and set an example. This is why one of the main slogans of the movement was "Let Britain lead."
So we're now moving on to the second part, which is a presentation of the anti-nuclear advocacy throughout the nations. I'm first going to focus on the Republic of Ireland, and then Claire is going to tell you about Wales, England, and well, the rest of the United Kingdom. The Irish Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament was formed in Ireland in 1958 with the support of many well-known patrons. The Cursey Islands were involved in the foundation of the group, and the first record of the organization in the Irish Times was a letter sent by Beatrice de Courcy Island herself, who was the honorary secretary of the Irish CND. So CND short for Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. She was a socialist, and she was the wife of John de Courcy Island, who was himself a maritime historian and the foremost leftist activist. The Irish CND's first large meeting took place in December 1958 and was chaired by Catherine Byrne, who was the mayor of Dublin. It took place in the Mansion House. There's a picture here on the slide. The Irish Times published this picture that showed Mrs. Byrne sitting next to Irish physicist and Nobel laureate Ernest Walton, who researched atom splitting, and Professor O'Cala, who worked in the field of elementary particle physics. 3 years after its foundation, the Irish CND, that was led by physicist Anthony Farrington, had a 20-member council and decided to form a national committee with the Northern Ireland sister organization. The organization had about 200 active members. I mean, members who attended meetings, mostly students, and many females among them. Beatrice de Courcy mentioned suspicion that there was a communist inspiration behind the Irish CND, with the participation, among others, of notorious communists such as Roy Johnston and members of the Irish Workers' League. De Courcy claimed that the fact that the organization had supported the Italian president at the time who had stood against Russia's underground testing, had allayed the fears and drawn more members. However, the communist suspicion was still led by John McQuaid, who was the Archbishop of Dublin, and who refused to meet with the Irish CND. He also enjoined other members of the Catholic hierarchy to act likewise, to refuse to meet the members of the board of the Irish CND, including the Bishop of Cork, for example. So some prominent members of the Catholic Church were still opposed to this development of a nuclear weapon, as was, for example, the Bishop of Galway, and despite McQuaid's position, he voiced his opposition to nuclear weapon as well as his opposition to communism. By doing this, he was in line with Pius XII's 1955 and 1956 Christmas messages, in which the Pope opposed the position and use of atomic weapon and explained the irreconcilability of communist and Christian teachings. Informing the public about the risk of nuclear tests was extremely important. So the organization set up public meetings and conferences, and they had a double strategy. They used their own newsletter that was called The Banner, that was circulated in the Republic of Ireland with about 500 issues. And they also wrote to national newspapers on a regular basis. They organized public events to draw attention to the cause with auctions and fundraisings. Of course, as what Claire described before, they participated in marches and protests. The first demonstration that was organized by the Irish CND took place in front of the French embassy. You have a picture here on the slide. A delegation presented a resolution that had been voted by the organization on the need for France to change its policy regarding nuclear armament. The delegation was made up of trade unionists, of the chairwoman of the organization, the secretary that I mentioned before, and also two scientists. Scientists played an important part in the campaign. The British embassy was picketed as well after the arrest of Earl and Lady Russell that was mentioned by Claire, and who were the members and leaders of the Committee of 100. The American embassy was also picketed in 1962, as well as the French embassy again in 1963. And a photograph of a Garda dog. Garda is the police in the Republic of Ireland. So police dog leaping at Noel Brown, who was a TD and the leader of the National Progressive Democrats during a demonstration outside the American embassy, was shown on the front page of the Irish Times. That caused controversy and attracted some sympathy for the anti-nuclear cause. Some marches against armament took place in Dublin city centre, mostly led by students. For example, 200 people marched against the bomb tests in October 1951. Actually, that day they were met by a counter march with people throwing flour and tomato and chanting, "We want the bomb," as an answer to the ban the bomb banners. Another anti-war march was organized in Dublin in February 1962, when discussions were being held about the possibility for the Republic of Ireland to join NATO. But it seems that some activists feared that marches, and more specifically the picketing of embassies, would be, well, detrimental to the efficiency of the anti-nuclear advocacy, because, well, it could potentially alienate the rather sympathetic Irish government. In May 1962, Anthony Farrington, I told you about him before, I don't know if you remember, he was the leader of the Irish campaign. He sent a letter to John de Courcy Allen, so one of the foremost activists, stating, as you can read on the slide, "I personally do not believe that marching and demonstrating and having interviews to protest does any good. But interviews with foreign embassies, which these embassies obviously do not like, however little notice they may take of them, may prejudice our good position with our Department of External Affairs. And it is true that the Irish CND had a very good relationship with the Irish government, more specifically with the Department of External Affairs. In fact, the Republic of Ireland's advocacy for peacekeeping, disarmament, and nuclear disarmament was characteristic of its stance at the United Nations, while soon after it joined the UN in December 1955. Researcher Richard Sinnott commented on the, quote, strong and enduring commitment to nuclear non-proliferation in Irish policy making, end quote, during the Cold War. From the late 1950s, Frank Aiken, who was the Irish Minister of External Affairs, led ambitious campaigns at the UN General Assembly, where he tried to advocate non-proliferation. Various organizations promoting peace supported him at home, including the Irish pacifist movement, which had originally, which was influenced by Quakerism, and also the Irish CND. Additionally, and very importantly, from its creation in the late 1950s, the Irish CND had a distinct identity from the English CND because of its focus on the defense of Irish neutrality. That was particularly striking in the early 1960s, which saw the unaligned Republic of Ireland become closer to the Western Bloc in the context of the first application to join the EEC, the Economic European Community, in 1961. So Irish CND activists relentlessly pressured the Irish government to respect and promote the traditional principle of Irish neutrality. To Sinnott, the Irish opposition to nuclear armaments directly derived from this principle of Irish neutrality. The Irish CND clearly positioned itself against military blocs and in favor of neutrality, as was explained by one activist who was the secretary of the organization, that was called Dermot Nolan, as you can see on the quote here. So he said in an interview, quote, the worst threat to the security of the human race lies on the existence of military blocs armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. To aggregate and consolidate those blocs by other countries joining them would, in our view, decrease our own security and that of the world. What we want to do is work to break up the military blocs. Instead of siding with this sort of association, we should ally ourselves with the neutral countries of Europe and the non-aligned countries and work to break up, as I said, those military blocs rather than consolidate them. And he then went on to describe Sweden as an example of a small neutral country like Ireland that had managed to put forward proposals at the United Nations and managed to find some common grounds between the two blocs. Beatrice de Courcy, who was the honorary secretary of the Irish CND, made the following comment on the strategy of the organization. She first underlined, so you can see the quotation here, she first underlined that, of course, in the Republic of Ireland, there was no manufacturing of nuclear weapons, and that there was little point in staging displays of civil disobedience or sit-down demonstrations. But what they could do was try to influence the government to bring to the notice of the cabinet the unrest and uneasiness felt by the public today, because nuclear bombs know no political or geographical boundaries. And she made this statement as a four-man CND deputation sought to meet Frank Aiken that was going to discuss Soviet nuclear testing. The CND, the Irish CND, was delighted when the Irish diplomat Frederick Henry Boland was elected president of the UNGA, the United Nations General Assembly, in 1960. Beatrice de Courcy sent him a letter that stated, as you can see, quote, my council is convinced that holding a position of the highest responsibility as representative of one of many small nations threatened of annihilation, if these diabolical weapons are used, you will do all in your power to bring the governments of the world seriously to work on a solution to this problem. She was quite confident that he could make a difference, or at least try to encourage him to do so. The Irish CND also turned to opposition parties to raise the issues of nuclear demilitarization in the Dáil, the Irish Parliament.
Now we are going to see that inside the United Kingdom, the movement for nuclear disarmament was a transnational movement. First in Wales, a local branch of the CND was formed in 1958 in Cardiff, while other smaller independent groups were also created across the nation, like the Aberystwyth Committee on Nuclear Weapons. They later all affiliated to the Welsh National Council of CND, which was the main coordinating body. The Welsh Nationalist Party, Plaid Cymru, also played a key role in organising anti-nuclear protests in Wales since the early days of the movement in 1958. The party's president, Gwynfor Evans, was a long-time pacifist and also became a partisan of unilateral disarmament. He was a proponent of self-rule for each nation in order to break off what he called the domination of the big power states. He thought that self-government for Wales would allow the nation to voice its opposition to Britain's nuclear policy. The following statement from Plaid Cymru, dating from March 1958, conveys this idea. I quote, "There is no conceivable argument by which the use of nuclear weapons can be justified. We believe it is a duty of Wales to voice unmistakably her convictions in this matter, emphasizing the critical necessity for Welsh government to give true expression to what our people really feel. We believe that international relations should be based not on inside threats, but on cooperation. That is why we uphold the principle of self-government for every nation, and that is why we oppose nuclear armaments. The world must choose the politics of international cooperation or perish. There is no alternative." Local actions were organized in Wales and delegations were sent to support activists in the rest of the country. In 1961, the first anti-nuclear All Wales rally took place on Whit Saturday, and a number of Labour and Nationalist MPs spoke, including Gwynfor Evans. The following year, Welsh students, supported by local ministers, organized their own version of the Aldermaston March as a two-day event in February 1962, when a 200-strong group walked from Criccieth to Porthmadog and then to Blaenau Festiniog. This is a protest that you can see on the photograph behind us. The Scottish Council for, in Scotland now, the Scottish Council for Nuclear Disarmament was created in April 1958 in Edinburgh. Although the Scots had chosen to form their own separate organisation, they offered from the onset to work in close collaboration with CND in England. Other local groups were created in Glasgow, Aberdeen, Ayr, and Kirkcaldy, to name but a few. Scotland became a focal point for the whole of the movement after the British government agreed to host American nuclear missile launching submarines in the Holy Loch, not far from Glasgow. It was one of the rare places where the consequences of Britain's defence policy had taken a concrete form and could effectively be seen. In March 1961, the arrival of the Polaris submarines and of the USS Proteus, the vessel supporting them, sparked a series of large-scale direct action protests. Unlike previous actions of non-violent obstruction staged to protest against the building of nuclear weapon facilities in Britain, the campaign lasted much longer and managed to involve the local population. In November 1960, a first demonstration was organized in Glasgow to oppose the setting up of the American Polaris base, gathering 5,000 at its final rally. Similar events were organized regularly, including one in February 1961 that was described by the Scotsman as, I quote, "one of the biggest protest gestures Scotland had seen since the Labour Troubles." That is the Labour Troubles of the 1930s. The movement in Scotland also managed to get support from the trade unions, most notably from the miners and from some local branches in Glasgow and the west of Scotland, near the Holy Loch. In 1961 and 62, Anti-Polarist resolutions were taken and acclaimed at the rallies organized on May Day in Edinburgh and in Glasgow, and CND lorries were present in the parades. Activists also tried to board the American submarine tender using canoes when the ship arrived in early March 1961, but also when it was due to sail for practice. 3 of them succeeded twice, at the end of March and in early April, before being forcefully removed and charged with breach of peace. In May, a group of 50 attempted to board the Proteus at the same time, but they were violently pushed back by the American crew and the police. A few protesters also chose to set up a camp by the American base, signposted by an inscription reading "Free World," and stayed there for a few months. The marches, organized by the Scottish Council for Nuclear Disarmament, also had a clear nationalist dimension, with pipers frequently walking ahead of the marchers, as for instance during the march from Dunoon to Sandbank along the Holy Loch in March 1961, but also as the one organized in Edinburgh that you can see behind us. Some of the figures of the movement in Scotland included famous nationalists like Roland Muirhead, Oliver Brown, and Isabel Lindsay, who would run as a candidate for the SNP in 1970. One of the slogans used by local protesters in the Holy Loch fiercely declared, "Home rule for Scotland, Polarists must go," showing the link between both causes. Now, in Northern Ireland, a local CND branch was formed in Belfast in April 1958, and its first chairman was a Presbyterian minister called Alexander Watson. From the onset, it was supported by a number of Christian pacifist organizations like the Fellowship of Reconciliation. This could partly explain why the movement for nuclear disarmament in Northern Ireland managed to transcend the political-religious divide. At Belfast Queen's University, a student group was created, and 2 of its presidents in the early 60s came from the Catholic nationalist community, an achievement at the time when most student groups were segregated along similar lines as the rest of Northern Irish society. The repertoire of collective action was probably more moderate than in the rest of the UK and comprised mainly protest letters, petitions, rallies, vigils, demonstrations, and a few sit-ins and pickets, most notably in front of the American and French consulates, to protest against nuclear tests and policies pursued by both countries, respectively. What spurred on the movement in Northern Ireland was a declaration in November 1960 of Lord Brookborough, the Unionist Prime Minister, who said he would welcome a Polarist submarine base in Northern Ireland to bring more employment to the area. In 1962, at the height of the movement, the Easter March in Belfast gathered around 500 protesters who walked from Custom House Square to the City Hall. Some of the slogans that could be read on the banners, like "Ulster Marchers demand immediate test ban" or "Neutral Britain," suggested a tacit acceptation of Northern Ireland's constitutional status on the side of the Catholic nationalist participants. Their demands were also directed at the British government, as this resolution adopted at a CND conference in Belfast in February 1961 showed. I quote, "We demand that the British government put into effect immediately the United Nations resolution of September 1960, calling for total unilateral disarmament by initiating unilateral disarmament." We are now going to turn to cross-nation collaborations, and we are going to start with the long Easter marches. The emblematic 4-day-long Easter marches were the outcome of the successful collaboration between the myriad of local anti-nuclear groups across the British and Irish Isles. In 1958, the Direct Action Committee organized the first march covering the 52 miles separating London from the Nuclear Research Centre in Aldermaston, with the support of CND. They managed to gather about 10,000 at the initial rally in London, about 4,000 marchers on the way, and their numbers swelled again for the final rally to about 8,000. To guarantee the biggest turnout for the final rally, the organizers decided to reverse the route of the march the following years. In 1959, participation doubled with 20,000 in Trafalgar Square. Then it doubled again to 40,000 in 1960, to reach 100,000 in 1961, and a staggering 150,000 at the climax of the movement in 1962. Each year, supporters flocked from all parts of the archipelago, some as part of national delegations like the Irish delegation, or under the banner of their own organizations or local branches, like the Scottish Council for Nuclear Disarmament that you can see on the photograph, or the Belfast CND. Transnational marches were another feature of cross-nation collaboration. In September 1960, there was a first 400-mile-long march organized from Edinburgh to London. About 40 marchers took part every day, going from town to town to rally the public to their cause by handing out leaflets, stopping at factory gates, and attending meetings in the evenings. They relied on the support of local anti-nuclear groups for food and accommodation. The tactic was deemed so successful that a few months later, another similar march was arranged, but this time going from London all the way up to Scotland to the Polaris base at the Holy Loch. The event followed directly the Easter Isle de Marston March. Protesters left on Easter Monday from London, walked almost 600 miles in 7 weeks, and arrived at the Holy Loch for Whitsun. On the slide, you can see the moment when they crossed the border between England and Scotland. This action was organized jointly by the Direct Action Committee, the Scottish Council for Nuclear Disarmament, and various local CND groups, hosting the marches and organizing supporting meetings in the stopover towns and cities. In Manchester, Glasgow, and upon their arrival at the Holy Loch, the activists were greeted by crowds of a few thousands of supporters. The group numbered about 30 to 40 marchers every day, with a hardcore of 12 who completed the journey, having walked every single mile. Another Glasgow to London march was organized by the Scottish Committee of 100 in July 1963, during which the activists carried a 7-meter-long dummy Polaris rocket. Finally, cross-nation collaborations also involved solidarity actions. In February 1961, the Committee of 100 launched a civil disobedience campaign, which consisted in a series of sit-ins in meaningful sites, like the Ministry of Defense that you can see on the picture in London, which gathered participants in their thousands. The authorities rapidly cracked down on protesters and arrested hundreds of them, including the philosopher Bertrand Russell, who was a mere 89 years old at that point. Upon hearing that some activists were serving prison sentences, solidarity protests were organized across the archipelago, as with, for instance, students in Dublin, who picketed the British embassy to ask for their immediate release. It also led to the creation of the Scottish Committee of 100, formed in January 1962, which also managed to mount protests involving several hundreds, like its inaugural sit-in in front of the American consulate in Glasgow. Another significant type of collaboration within the movement was a peculiar relation between groups on both sides of the Irish border. In the early 1960s, there was still much animosity between the Belfast and the Dublin governments, and their respective leaders had never met in person. Dublin had never officially recognized the existence of Northern Ireland, which they called the Six Counties. In that context, it is striking to note that activists frequently crossed the border to attend a meeting or take part in a demonstration. As an example, a delegation from the Irish CND came for the Easter March organized in Belfast in 1962. It included some leading figures of the movement in the Republic, like Noel Brown and the de Courcys mentioned by Marie-Violaine. We have united with the Republic on the issue of nuclear disarmament. These were the words of the Presbyterian minister and chairman of the Belfast CND, Alexander Watson, at that meeting. And they show that to the activists, this collaboration was a gesture of reconciliation between North and South.
The Irish CND had strong connections with international sister organizations, more particularly in the United Kingdom. Irish activists, mostly youths, participated in the British anti-nuclear bomb marches that Claire has just described. That was the case from the start, from the first march to Britain's Atomic Research Information Department at Aldermaston in 1958, soon after the creation of the British CND. The Irish CND was actually set up in the wake of this 1958 Aldermaston March. So the British CND was a model to the Irish CND in many ways, despite, well, the very different relations with the national governments that I mentioned before. The Aldermaston March became a yearly Easter event in which the Irish participated. In April 1960, about 50,000 people gathered in London, where an Irish contingent marched under a black banner emblazoned with air and trimmed with two small tricolors. In Easter 1960, another march took place in Aldermaston, where British nuclear warheads were built with the participation of 70 Irish activists, including Dennis Hyday, who was then a student, but who would later become the United Nations humanitarian coordinator in Iraq. In 1962, the same annual march gathered 15,000 demonstrators. Now, with Claire, we are going to try to have a look at the impact that we think the movements had regarding nuclear disarmament. I'm first going to focus on the Republic of Ireland, and then Claire is going to tell you about what happened in Britain. So the partnership between the Irish CND and the Irish government was successful. At the United Nations, the Republic of Ireland sat together with a nuclear house, as Aiken put it, that was made up of the United States, the USSR, Great Britain, and soon France in 1960. In the late 1950s, in the context of rising Cold War tensions, and with an aim to try to preserve world security, Frank Aiken endeavored to advocate disarmament. Ireland had this unique perspective of a Western state that had historically suffered from colonization. And Frank Aiken posed as an advocate for peace at the UNGA, and he delivered, in October 1958, he delivered a major speech regarding nuclear disarmament. Non-proliferation of Irish weapons was a priority to the Irish delegation, and the Republic of Ireland proposed motions every year between 1958 and 1961, with, well, at the beginning, mixed responses from the nuclear club. That was until the unanimous adoption of the Irish resolution by the General Assembly in 1961. This victory resulted from years of skilled negotiations led by Aiken, followed by, well, afterwards 7 years of conciliation with the nuclear powers to actually implement the agreement. The year when the new UNGA adopted the Irish resolution, the CND, so activists, sent a letter of thanks to Frank Aiken for his, quote, vigorous and constructive efforts in the United Nations in the cause of nuclear disarmament. The Non-Proliferation Treaty was eventually signed in 1968, and as it found its origin in the Irish resolutions presented by Aiken from 1958, the minister Aiken was invited to sign the treaty first at the Moscow ceremony, and the Republic of Ireland was also a guest at the simultaneous ceremonies in London and Washington.
Now let's turn to Britain. The movement for nuclear disarmament did not manage to obtain unilateral disarmament from the British government. Nevertheless, it was perceived as successful by the activists, who felt it had won a substantial victory in the shape of the Partial Test Ban Treaty of July 1963. Through this agreement, the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain consented to stop nuclear tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. To celebrate this achievement, the members of the Committee of 100 decided to invite Lord Hailsham, the Lord President of the Council and Minister for Science, who had gone to Moscow to negotiate and sign the treaty on behalf of the government. So the activists decided to invite him to become an honorary member of their group. It is not clear whether he ever accepted. In 1963, the movement began to lose support and decline, both because of internecine quarrels over tactics, but also because many felt that the threat of a nuclear war had receded in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. The world had come very close to nuclear disaster, but its peaceful resolution and the setting up of a hotline between Washington and Moscow contributed to ease tensions and pave the way to the detente.
Okay, so we're going to conclude with trying to assess the influence on subsequent movements. The Irish CND almost ceased its activities from the mid-1960s. In the 1970s, the Irish Peace Group was a short-lived Irish branch of the World Peace Council. It was founded in 1973 by trade unionists, but they were not very successful in Ireland. Another very small group, the Campaign Against the Arms Trade, was set up, but they did not manage to rally much support. And the anti-nuclear movement stopped progressively. However, with the context of the Vietnam War, in the mid-1960s, well, activists turned to the creation of a new group called the Irish Voice on the Vietnam War, and that was really the new focus of anti-war activism. This group, the Irish Voice on the Vietnam War, had many similarities with the Irish CND regarding the strategies, regarding the people involved, regarding the discourse. However, the main difference was the fact that there was really a break with the partnership between the Irish government and activists, since in the 1960s, after the mid-1960s, the activists reproached the Irish government for not being vocal on the issue of the Vietnam War. So they did not support the action of the Irish government, as was the case regarding nuclear armaments. However, they tried to act differently. The Irish CND resumed activities later on in the late 1970s, in 1979. The context, the geopolitical context that I described at the start, had changed again. Carter was in government in the United States. He had refused to sign or to ratify the SALT II treaty regarding nuclear disarmament. There were decisions made by NATO also regarding nuclear missiles in Europe. The Soviets had intervened in Afghanistan. So some geopolitical instability. And also in Ireland, there were plans to build a nuclear plant. So that was one of the reasons for the resurrection, the rebirth of the Irish CND in 1979. And this second version of the Irish CND was more successful than the first version of the CND, since in 1983, it recorded 6,000 members. They benefited from the collective action repertoire that had been created by the first version of the CND regarding, well, the lobbying of the government, regarding the picketing of embassy, informing the public marches, but also they were influenced by the direct action model from the British CND, which had not been the case before. Also, collaboration in the 1980s with the Scottish movement, for example, were much more important than in the 1950s and 60s.
In the UK, the movement was perceived as successful by its participants, who felt that the partial test ban treaty was a sign that their protests had managed to force the government to backtrack. This perception had crucial repercussions on subsequent movements, because it signaled an opening in the structure of political opportunities, leading activists defending other causes to step into the breach. The repertoire of contention used by the partisans of nuclear disarmament would continue to be used for the next decades. Non-violent direct action, in particular, had gained mass appeal. The main cause that quickly replaced nuclear disarmament in the hearts and minds of protesters was the Vietnam War, as Marie-Violaine explained. But in Britain, the escalation of the conflict in 1964 and the reaction of the Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson, who chose to give material support to the United States and back their war aims, changed the situation somehow. So the organizational framework of the movement for nuclear disarmament laid the base for the emergence of the movement against the war in Vietnam, and CND endorsed that cause. More and more banners with anti-Vietnam slogans appeared during the long Easter marches, and in 1967, the original route was altered to start from the United States Air Force Base in Ruislip, in the outskirts of northwest London. And the symbol of nuclear disarmament continued to be used as, no, you can't see that on that picture, sorry. You can see the sign, but it's not a picture protesting against the Vietnam War. So that particular symbol, what I meant was that it became more universally a symbol for peace. In Scotland and Wales, new waves of nationalist movements were beginning to gather speed. It could be argued that the issue of nuclear disarmament contributed to some extent to rekindle nationalist grievances. And in the following years, specific nationalist organizations would be formed involving a lot of students and young people and resorting to some of the same direct action tactics used by anti-nuclear activists like sit-ins and occupations. In Northern Ireland, the Northern Irish civil rights movement protesting against religious discrimination emerged in the mid-1960s, and some of its main leaders had earned their stripes in the movement for nuclear disarmament. Conversely, the participation of Northern Irish activists in the movement in Great Britain also served to raise awareness on anti-Catholic discrimination, most notably with public statements from CND Chairman Canon John Collins and other prestigious Protestant leaders. Finally, in an area where marching was previously reserved to sectarian parades, the movement for nuclear disarmament played a key role in organizing non-sectarian protests, managing to bridge the political-religious divide. In the rest of the country, at the end of the 1970s, the movement for nuclear disarmament would be revived, partly thanks to protests against nuclear plants emanating from environmentalists, nuclear power plants, sorry, emanating from environmentalists, but also because of the British government's adoption of the new nuclear missile program named Trident in 1980. This second wave managed to outshine the feats of their predecessors, with their biggest rally mustering over 250,000 protesters in London in October 1981. And this is the illustration that you can see behind us. Thank you very much for your attention.